1946 article published in Far Eastern Survey claimed that, 4 decades earlier, there were rumors that the Emperor of Japan was very seriously considering converting to Islam. The article does not cite a source, and it appears that the claim holds no veracity. But the notion is not as inherently infeasible as it may seem. In the aftermath of the stunning modernization of Japan's economy and military at the turn of the 20th century, Muslims around the world kept a very close eye on the island nation in the Pacific. Europe had already laid out the blueprint to success: invest in science, finance, and industry, which they used to colonize huge swathes of the Muslim world. Now, Muslim leaders and intellectuals wanted to introduce it into their own societies. If the Japanese could catapult themselves from quiet solitude to a spot on the world stage, perhaps then the storied warriors and scholars from the Islamic tradition could reclaim their positions there too. Today, join me as I explore how Japan inspired the Islamic world. Throughout the world, the 19th century saw the total collapse of the influence of Asian and African nations relative to the growing dominance of Europe and the United States. Japan, however, was an exception. After begrudgingly allowing American access to the region in 1854 under the threat of gunfire, a patented act of gunboat diplomacy, the Japanese adopted a constitution and series of reforms aimed at modernizing their nation. Named for the emperor who initiated many of these reforms, this Meiji restoration rapidly transformed Japan into an imperial power as mighty as those in the West. The Russian Empire learned this lesson firsthand. In 1904, years of tension fueled by mutual interest in controlling Manchuria and Korea exploded with a Japanese attack on the Russian Navy at Port Arthur and the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War. Overconfident and incompetent, the shocked Russians were humiliated by the Japanese in just over 18 months. The acknowledgement of Japanese suzerainty over previously Russian-controlled territory hurt, but far more damaging was the blow to Russian prestige. Domestically and internationally, Russia's status as a great power was increasingly in doubt. Contrarily, Japan had asserted itself as an undeniable power in its own right. Western nations, though startled by the conflict's result, recognized that Japan had proven itself as a capable rival to their own global desire and influence. Likewise, Muslims in Asia were ecstatic. Some Muslims, particularly in Iran and the Ottoman Empire, found no greater pleasure than in watching the humbling of their detested Russian neighbors. But others saw an opportunity. In roughly 4 decades, the Japanese had bested a Western power that used to bully them. Perhaps peoples elsewhere could best other Western powers too. The hopes that Muslims had harbored for decades of expelling and perhaps overtaking the West clearly were not impossible. Rapidly, communication lines between Japan and Muslim states and individuals opened, and the interest was not unrequited. As Muslims became fascinated at the prospect of an imitation model for Western resistance, Muslim notables and Japanese state agents made contact, planting seeds for a future friendship. Among the most important of these Muslim actors was the Russian-born Tatar Abdurrashid Ibrahim. Belonging to the Jadid movement, Ibrahim believed that the contemporary Islamic world had been perverted by self-interested leadership that willingly submitted to Western imperialists for their own gain. The Jadidists were a political and religious movement that sought an Islamic revival and certain Western-style reforms. The world had moved past the Muslims, and to Ibrahim and other Jadids, the only way to revive the Ummah was to catch up to the rest of the world by adopting new technology and social reforms. Thus, when Ibrahim noticed the swift technological advancement of Meiji Japan before most other Muslims had, he was intrigued. The Russo-Japanese War only heightened his interests. In 1909, Ibrahim befriended Mitsutaru Yamaoka, a Japanese veteran from the war against Russia and agent of the army's military police, who converted to Islam. Taking the name of Omar, Yamaoka became an exceptionally pious follower of Allah and an ardent proponent of Muslim interests, one wielding influence within the Japanese government. Ibrahim, Yamaoka, and several other Japanese politicians banded later that year to form the Asian Congress, which championed Pan-Asianism as a means to counter the West. Indeed, many Muslim scholars emphatically welcomed collaboration with the Japanese government and the use of their nation as a case model for modernization. The Iranian writer Abdul Rahim Talibi was a staunch constitutionalist and unequivocal in his belief that the Iranian status quo was impermissible. His book, Masail al-Hayat, translating roughly to the challenges of life, flatly rejects conservative and absolutist regimes, and ends with a translation of the Japanese constitution into written Persian. In a 1910 article, the Syrian nationalist Shukri al-Asali describes the successful Japanese modernization and subsequent victory over Russia as being indicative of how the East awakened, and shares his hopes for a future free of Western dominance. The Turkish poet Namik Ekrem took a markedly pan-Asian approach. He criticized the West as stealing beliefs and technology that were Eastern in their origin, and adds that the West could not have been able to make any scientific advancements themselves if they did not have access to Eastern records. In Afghanistan, Mahmud Tarzi, the Muslim modernist intellectual, poetically expressed admiration for the way the Japanese had, quote, like bees searching throughout the flowering fields and meadows of the world, have gathered the honey of the technical skill. Tarzi would go on to translate and publish a book on the Russo-Japanese War so that his fellow Afghans could use it to glean lessons from Japan's success. In Egypt, the Lebanese ulama Rashid Ridha continuously highlighted and praised Japanese progress in his newspaper Al-Manar. Ridha is seen by some historians today as the father of the modern Salafist movement, but this actually belies the nuances of his outlook. Like Tarzi, Ridha was a Muslim modernist who was obsessed with bringing a revival of Islam that he, like the Jadidists, believed would allow Muslims to overthrow their European colonizers. Ridha's mentor, the prestigious ulama Muhammad Abduh, also wrote positively about Japan's advances in Ridha's Al-Manar newspaper. For all of these reformist Muslim thinkers, Japan's modernization was a confirmation that their hypothesis was indeed correct. If you adopt and balance European-style scientific and technological advancements with an appreciation for your own cultural and spiritual roots, you can stand up to the West. As late as 1930, new organizations advocating for the interests of Muslims were being established in Imperial Japan. Likewise, the Asian Congress was an active and robust participant in Japanese politics, even managing to provide Muslim resistance groups in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, with supplies and training. Undoubtedly, the confidence instilled in Muslims in part by the Japanese must have been refreshing. Unfortunately, it would be short-lived. Gradually, the same nations and thinkers that had been enthralled with the potential of Japan became disillusioned as well, for a myriad of different reasons. For one, it became clear that the Japanese were not the natural allies to Muslims that was originally presented. The increased presence of Japanese militarism and authoritarianism was greatly unappealing to much of the original Muslim base. Worse than this was the realization that Japanese Pan-Asianism did not inherently translate to equality among all Asians. Even before the full invasion of China in 1937 and the breakout of World War II 2 years later, Japanese authorities struggled to describe their activities in Manchuria and Korea as anything less than occupation. Any hope that may have remained regarding equality under Pan-Asianism would have been resoundingly crushed after the brutal Japanese treatment of the inhabitants of the Dutch East Indies, a majority of whom were Muslim. Moreover, it is unlikely that Pan-Asianism could ever have been sustainable as a vehicle for resistance. Much of the contact between Japanese and Muslim agents was initiated by the Japanese out of a desire to win influence, rather than a request made by Muslims for aid. Not to mention, leadership in some Muslim nations, such as Qajar, Iran, relied heavily on Western favors to keep their position secure. Similarly, leadership in the nascent Turkish Republic and Iranian Pahlavi dynasty, though resentful of the West, wanted to maintain access to Western technology and expertise, and so preferred to keep relations cordial. Given the multitude of obstacles to consistent and long-term collaboration between the Muslim world and Japan, it is unsurprising that contact essentially halted altogether when Japan's impending defeat in the Pacific theater of World War II appeared inevitable. In the end, the Islamic interest in Japan's development did not bring about much tangible results. But it does show that Muslims whose lands had fallen to the Europeans were actively resisting their colonizers. It also shows a different model of modernization that Muslim societies could have looked up to. Currently, most of the Islamic world is under the commercial and to some extent cultural influence of the West, especially the USA. It is yet to be decided how much longer this continues to be the case. Thank you guys for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for always supporting. If you want to financially support Hikmah History, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace!